known to many of us, and known to many of us in the CONCORD secretariat because our library is named after you. And I think, yes, so I think that shows a little bit that your interaction with CONCORD. You're certainly a friend of CONCORD, and we consider you a friend, but I also consider you a critical friend. We have this concept of the critical friend, and that's what we all need, and I think we really rely on you to be our critical friend. For those who don't know you, human rights activist from El Salvador, who worked with Archbishop Romero in the 1970s and 1980s, in the really dark days of the conflict in Central America, and since then hasn't stopped fighting for social justice. And Marta is also very engaged in many international processes, and so I think has a good view on how you work with Archbishop Romero. The climate talks, you've just come from Bonn, from the climate talks, so I think that you have this perspective of how these international processes relate to the communities that you work with in Latin America and elsewhere. Martin, you have had a route that many of us know very, very well, working with Oxfam and Save the Children in senior advocacy roles. But I think what you're both most well known for, and I think what we're all working on, values and frames. And this, I mean, that must be 10, 12 years old now, the values and frames work. Yeah, yeah. And I were at a workshop in the summer where we had a whole morning on values and frames, and just to say how refreshing that methodology remains to those of us that have done it many times, and for those that come to it afresh, it is a revelation and still seems very relevant to our day. So I think that you're obviously somebody who that's all. So something that we need. We get into our comfort zone, we think we have a framework, and okay, let's follow that. And I think you're somebody that challenges us and has challenged us to reevaluate where we are today. So without any more ado, Martin, I'm going to speak to us, and then I'm going to ask Martin to respond.
Thank you very much. Right, first thing I have to do is just ask a little bit of your patience. Today that I've never done before. Normally, I just have off the cuff, but I really wanted to get this argument right for you guys. Because I really think this is a moment in time where we do have to do some self-reflection. We assess where we're coming from. So I have a speech, I don't have a lectern, I'm not really sure physically what to do with myself. So I'm just going to ask you, actually, if I turn that off, can you guys look back in? Oh, it's for the live stream. Okay. All right. Well, you're just going to have this is going to be a bit clunky and a little bit, you know. So we'll just have to see how we go. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much. I didn't realise somebody had to fight and really make the case for us, for Marta and I to be here. So whoever did that, thank you very much. I very rarely come and speak in Europe these days, being based in the US, especially to a group of campaigners. This really feels like a sort of homecoming. So thank you very much for having me. I want to start by telling a story, and particularly my own story. I've done this once before in a setting like this, but the last time I did it was really because I was a little lost. I didn't really have anything much to offer other than my own story that I felt I could stand behind with confidence. I had a lot of critiques, and this was when a lot of the frames and value stuff started, but I had very little in terms of coherent suggestions and responses. And I think looking back, and with the benefit of hindsight, oh wow. Okay. No, I think this is easy. Okay, thank you. With the benefit of hindsight, I realised that one way to describe what was happening to me a lot was that the narratives about, the big narratives about how the world works, that I had believed in for so long, for most of my career up to that point, they were starting to break down for me. They were starting to not make so much sense. And another way of saying that is my worldview was changing at quite a fundamental level. The narratives I'm talking about can be difficult to see. They're the ones that are so familiar and so accepted that we often don't even acknowledge they're there. They live in and inform all aspects of how we live. Most of the time, we don't even think of them as narratives. It's like common sense. What sort of narratives do I mean? I started out investigating the deep narratives around poverty, how we understand and talk about global poverty, the foundational narratives of our culture. Things like, what is an economy? What is progress? What makes a human life happy and fulfilled? Relationship to the earth. What are the meta-human systems that we call civilizations? What are the rules that govern their rise and their fall? And none of this was a diversion from the original investigation into poverty. It was the required path to unlearn and then relearn my own professional purpose and craft. There are any number of paths you can take, and this was just the path I took. And it was a very strange path to travel in some respects. It was destabilizing, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. It created distance between me and my colleagues and friends. It sent my career spiraling off in very unexpected directions, financial and futuristic. So this felt like quite a high-risk thing to do. But most importantly, what defined it was this feeling of being lost. This is something that we in our line of work. It doesn't lend itself to job descriptions and campaign strategies. We like people to have practical solutions that we can campaign on, rather than big open questions that take time to explore. People, some of this space. Campaigns. Thanks to some extraordinary privilege and luck, I was able to survive this period of staying lost and still have a job, almost in the sector. We had to set up an organisation to do it. Funding we could do it. And to be honest, I did have to take one step away from the sector. It felt like standing on a small boat in a very stormy sea, the water swirling and churning beneath my feet, and me doing my best to stay upright and moving forward, without really knowing what forward was anymore. One point I want to make to you. The experience that I went through there is instructive of how narratives change. They are not simply replaced overnight, one with another, like switching between TV channels. It is very often not an easy or a painless process. It requires self-reflection and a willingness to be lost. Because old narratives and the logics they contain must first fracture and lose their coherence. They must stop feeling like common sense. Because this creates a vacuum, a cosmic and cognitive imperative that demands the new narratives fill the space. As the old saying goes, nature abhors a vacuum. It cannot exist for long. Not being able to make sense of the world is one of the things we call madness. And so we are extremely efficient at finding meaning in patterns of information. Narratives are those patterns of logic. Get it into a coherent form. And when old narratives crack apart, new narratives can and will, because by the laws of nature they must, go to take their place. Through concrete. And actually, like living green shoots through dead hard concrete. So now I'm going to tell my story again, but this time with a far greater sense of purpose. Not only because I'm not feeling quite as lost, I'm still feeling lost, I think we all are in many respects, and we should accept and embrace that. But also because I know now why telling my story actually matters at moments like this. One thing I love is listening to storytellers, particularly the storytellers of the indigenous nations of the US, where I now live. They are masters at it. They say that one of the most powerful things we can each do, from our own stories, stand firm on the earth, speak our truths as we see them. And the reason this is so important is that the personal is the starting point for integrity. The only fully authentic perch from which we can speak. Everything else is a form of projection that can separate you from your deepest truths and values. This is generally true about storytelling, but if we had to speak our story, Every time we'd spoken, we'd been in every single meeting for days. I'm going to indulge today because I expect the arguments I'm going to make to you is going to be pretty provocative. And it helps you to understand something of who I am when I make it, that it is informed in. If only so that gives you a place to go to rip it apart. A quick definition to start with. It'll be really helpful for our purposes today if we can distinguish between stories and narratives. There's a long discussion we can have about this, but for the sake of time and today and focus, can I just offer a definition for us to work with? Can we say that stories are complete arcs, wholly visible to our conscious minds? A personal story, for example, that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has characters, it has movement. It is usually quite linear in the way that you can see cause and effect in one complete and hopefully compelling package. That's a story. Narratives are more like arrangements of logic in a coherent form. They usually reside, at least largely, in the subconscious. They are the deep, sense-making structures in our brains. They certainly can and do sometimes play out in a nice linear story-like fashion, but they are also each of the individual bits of logic that makes up a narrative. Let me give you an example. One piece of logic that makes up our economic and actually our cultural narrative is that growth is good. We've been told this so consistently for so long that it certainly has the feel of common sense. We could make a story of it by putting some character around it, some movement, some cause and effect. For example, Popeye used to be small and weak, then he ate spinach, and then he became big and strong. Growth is good. But growth is good can also stand alone as an essential logical component in a narrative that makes up the system that we live in, by which I mean capitalism, feel like common sense. Here's how you know this. If you don't believe that growth is good, you cannot easily hold on to a belief in capitalism. It loses its coherence. Because capitalism is a system that expresses the logic of growth. In fact, it's not overstating the case to say that capitalism is a system that exists to create growth, specifically growth in the supply of capital. The clue is really in the name. Because that is its number one rule, the prime directive for any Star Trek fans out there. Take growth away and you no longer have capitalism. It is one vital piece in the logic in the narrative, buried deep, as a logic many of us have received but not fully tested ourselves. It is entwined with assumptions and emotions. Unless you are actively persuaded against it, it will feel like common sense to you. So, the stories are the complete arcs of cause and effect. Narratives are the coherent constructs of logic that provide meaning to our world, mostly in the subconscious. So back to the personal story. So I have lived a traveling life, like I'm sure many of you have. I was born in Kenya, I grew up in Kuwait. My professional life has been on planes and trains, now living mostly in the US, a little bit in Costa Rica, and not at all in the UK, much to my parents' displeasure. These are my parents. These are the people from whom I get my reviews. This is my fiancé, that one. His name is Kwame. He's a professor at Colorado University, where I live, and he teaches ethnic studies. Look at that smile. He's the most playful and sweet and smart and irritating person I know. Here's our dog. Yes. He is just love on legs. And this is one of my favourite walks near where I live. I always think I can feel the earth moving when I walk here. It's quite primal, I don't know why. And these are some of the intimate things in my life. The people, the places, and obviously the dog, the ground that root me. Tomorrow, but later this afternoon in the masterclass session, I'm going to ask each of you to share a picture or two about the intimate spaces of your life. Something that what your work colleagues rarely or ever see. Something that brings you warmth, that opens your heart. I can't look at any of those pictures without my heart opening. These are the things that unleash the fullest possible spectrum of my human capacities because they mean more to my heart than my head. They open up all my ways of knowing. And this is one thing I'm going to ask all of us to do today. My childhood in Kuwait was very happy. I was a terrible college student. I hated the lectures. I didn't go to most of them. The knowledge never felt very alive for me, and I certainly got the grades to go with that. Since college, I've been working in social justice in one form or another. I started out being a student activist, mostly on LGBT issues. That went doing health promotion work in North London. That became national HIV advocacy work with Terence Higgins Trust, and that took me to Save the Children, where I was head of global advocacy. Then I took the head of campaigns job with Oxfam, and that's when it all started to go either right or wrong, depending on how much you agree with me by the end of the speech. I was 36 when I joined Oxfam. I was on a good career path, full of confidence. I wasn't a closet radical. I wasn't harboring any serious doubts about anything except my own professional capacities. It wasn't until I started looking at cognition, at the psychology of belief, that the old development stories really began to fracture for me. So Seamus talked about frames and values work, and yes, I know that's something that I am known for. But that was really only the beginning. And that started out with cognitive linguistics. Before I took the Oxfam job, I read two books back to back. The Political Mind by George Lakoff and The Political Brain by Drew Weston. And both pointed to me to something I hadn't really thought about much before, this science behind belief. Up until then, I had lived in a world, like most of us, of mostly policy papers, issue-specific research, and political power maps. Now I was looking at the human brain, how the human brain processes information to construct narratives that give shape and meaning to reality. It was quite a leap. I met Tom Crompton at WWF in 2009, and he'd been on a similar journey. Together with a few others, we developed frames and values work. We wrote big, heavy reports like CONCORD, like Finding Frames. We produced this sort of collaborative, heavy, quite academic type, because that's how NGOs process big ideas, especially in policy departments, which is the gold standard for what we expect. And after 4 years of doing that at Oxfam, I was exhausted and demoralized, feeling like I was hitting my head against a brick wall and not really understanding why. I was. Then I met Alma. Actually, I had to say this story. When we met this morning, the first thing Marta said was, "Don't be so kind to me. Be hard." Anyway, then I met Al Morlaga, my co-founder of the Rules. He'd read the Frames of Values work, and he made me the irresistible offer of putting my money where my mouth was, and actually coming and setting up an organization with him to put that learning into practice. So I hopped on a plane to New York, and off we went. And what started out in 2012, when I was at the not-so-tender age of 40, I had plenty of ideas about what I didn't want to do, what I didn't like, but very little about what we could offer instead. Because what was quickly becoming apparent was if you want to work on the deep logic of the stories we tell, how we make meaning of the work, different skill sets and different inputs from traditional campaigning. It can't be done with just organizers and policy-defined petitions and street marches and lobbying. It is essentially a different discipline from advocacy campaigning, where advocacy campaigning seeks to alter specific decisions made by people in power. Narrative campaigning tries to affect the logical context within which decisions are made. From the lens of frames and values, I moved on to the complexity sciences. I could bore you all day why this is so vital, but for the sake of time, I'll leave it to one thing. One of the things we have got so horribly wrong in the last few hundred years is believing that the world is a machine. We can thank Descartes and the Enlightenment for this. For all the wonderful things the Enlightenment unleashed, it also locked us into this horrible and inaccurate metaphor of the world as a machine. That is simply wrong. The world is not a machine that has lots of individual parts, like a car, that can be broken down, understood in their entirety, and built up again. That can be fixed or even broken in the way a machine can. The world is an infinitely complex, ever-adapting, ever-evolving system. What matters less is the individual parts between them. The interconnections, the energy flows, the patterns, the movement, and the logic the logic that the movement articulates, that is captured in narratives. From complexity to evolutionary biology, an extraordinary field that tells us an enormous amount about why we do what we do. It shows us, for example, what role altruism plays, and why that is a central evolutionary force to understand interconnections. From there, but I needed more. I needed to know more from the purely human systems perspective. So I started to look at the world, look at people like Joseph Tainter, Daniel Quinn, and Jared Diamond on the rise and fall of civilizations. That took me back into deep history, to the origins of agriculture, the early experiments with surplus production, which is basically making and growing more physical stuff than is needed for immediate needs. And one of the long threads of those experiments, in this 10,000-year-old story, is capitalism. I had paid dirt, the good stuff. A knowledge system that brought all the others together into an elegant, mind-bending package. Instructions of the indigenous people of North America, which shares a core worldview with many of the surviving indigenous cultures from all around the world, from the Aborigines of Australia to the Cobra of Peru. It is sometimes called. And for all the variations there are, all the different mythologies and cosmologies, there is a remarkably consistent core narrative that they all share. Everything I had learned from the cognitive sciences, complexity and evolutionary biology, indeed what I was learning on my own personal spiritual journey, this work. Not in the ways that we would easily recognize it, but in the metaphors and deep logic. And right to the burning heart of these narratives is the idea of interdependencies. And the most important, the most truthful of these interdependencies is that between humans and the world around us. Grandmother Nature, as she's sometimes called. The interconnection to be all interconnections. The truth of unity. Of those narratives as they poke into our world. The communities of Standing Rock made a very strong and clear point to say, we are not protesters. We are protectors. That one little word shift could easily be passed over as if it were nothing. But it is, in truth, the tip of a whole other cosmology and approach to life. You haven't already, to go and really look at the language that came out from Standing Rock. It should be a rich source of inspiration to us. And if any of you are a Paris COP, and I don't know if we saw this again in COP23, you'll also have seen the phrase, we are not protecting nature, we are nature fighting back. Another lovely example. The Navajo Nation in the US speak about coal as the liver of the earth. The liver of the earth. Let that sit in your mind for a moment. This is what we call a systemic metaphor. What makes it a metaphor, obviously, is that coal is not literally a liver. Livers are fleshy things that live inside animal bodies. But coal is like a liver. What makes it systemic is that it immediately positions coal within the system of the body. We know that instinctively that our livers are part of our body. We wouldn't need to think much to know if you took away the liver, the rest of the body would die. Interconnectedness. And what's glorious is this metaphor stands up to scientific scrutiny. Just as the liver serves to detoxify the body, coal serves to detoxify the environment. Formed over millions of years and buried as buried organic matter, heat and pressure, coal seams underground function like a giant filter, sequestering heavy metals and other toxins as water percolates through them. When coal is kept in the ground, it helps keep our water safe and clean. When it is mined and burned, toxins accumulated over millions of years of filtration are released into the environment. 178 words to explain what that metaphor does instantly. You might not get all the detail, but you will get the most important point. Coal is connected to everything else. Yes, but most people have an instinctive grasp of what the liver performs a particular function in your body. in the way that coal performs a particular function in the Earth. It's connected to the very health of this planet. It is not an inert substance, just waiting, dead, until humans found a use for it. It has a natural function in the Earth, far beyond the energy it produces for us. When we frame coal as a dirty energy source, and only a dirty energy source, which is practically the only way we can frame it, we are underselling its true function and significance. We instruct our audiences to see it as separate from everything else. This is the world as machine metaphor working its unhelpful magic on us. And it stands in stark contrast with the interconnected system logic which is carried in the coal as liver metaphor. Of course, one metaphor is only as powerful as the broader narrative it lives within. That single metaphor alone will not switch people's opinion, but it is the right sort of start. And if you build a narrative with these sorts of metaphors, this language of interconnectedness, each metaphor starts to sing louder, more confidently. A choir is born. A choir that sings about the full living earth, the sweetness of its song, and the deep logic of balance and harmony. And yes, interconnectedness. Okay, this has been a bit of a winding path, and we're not yet landing squarely in our interest zone of international development campaigning. So let me bring it together. This is what I now believe. The international development project is built on rotten foundations. These foundations can be traced back through the current neoliberal age, back through the oil crises of the 1970s, the post-colonial era of relative freedom for what we now call developing countries, back through colonialism and the Atlantic slave trade, all the way back past the Industrial Revolution to the European Enlightenment and beyond. When you break down the narratives of poverty and development we tell today, and the way we structure the development project from those narratives, we find DNA-like traces of all those past ages still at play. This is why we are essentially still behaving like we believe rich people to be morally superior to poor people. Or that we believe the measure of a fulfilled life is how productive we are in a transactional marketplace. Or that there is one right way to live, and that right way is our way. Our hyper-consumptive, market-fundamentalist way of life lived in increasingly artificial, toxic bubbles. The development project and the development narrative is one way that we project this view. Just to give you a provocative example, especially in light of that video we saw this morning. The agenda of empowerment of women and girls. You'll see a lot of education along Western lines, a lot of training to get women into the transactional marketplace as their path to freedom. Just listen to how UN Women talked about it. I did have a slide, I took it out. Okay, this is from UN Women. Quote, investing in women's economic empowerment sets a direct path towards gender equality, poverty eradication, and inclusive economic growth. Women make enormous contributions to the economies, whether in business, on farms, as entrepreneurs, or employers, or by doing the unpaid care work at home, unquote. And you can feel the values in that statement. The will, the desire to help women, which is wonderful. Please don't mistake anything I say next as criticizing that value or that instinct. What I am challenging is not values or the intention, but the method. This is essentially saying women get freedom when they become successful capitalists, when they orient their lives around the transactional marketplace. And it feels like common sense in a way, right? Because at one level it is. To be successful in this system, you must perform according to the system's logic. As long as we are in this system, living our materially comfortable lives, it is the height of privilege to suggest others should not have access to the same thing. Quite right. But what do we do when that system also has the sort of fundamental problems that ours has? As the British economist David Fleming puts it, the only problem with capitalism is that it destroys the planet and it's based on growth. I mean, apart from those two little details, there's got a lot to be said. I would argue that you have to have a very limited view of freedom and a very withered imagination to believe that this capitalist way of life is not just the only option, but the pinnacle of human achievement, the apex model, the one that everybody must subscribe to. If you ask the Zapatistas of Mexico or the tribes of Standing Rock, or even the broad movement of peasant farmers represented by groups like La Via Campesina. And they will tell you in one way or another that the essential market fundamentalist logic of capitalism is what they reject, what they want to be spared from. Many North American First Nations describe the essential element of Western culture as wetiko. Wetiko is an Algonquin word. Algonquin is one of the North American tribes. A mystic spirit that is driven by greed, excess, and selfish consumption. In Ojibwa, it is Windigo. In Powhatan, Utinko. So all the various tribes have a variant of this concept. It deludes its host into believing that cannibalizing the life force of others in the broad sense, not just other humans, but other animals and all other forms of Gaian life, is a logical and morally upright way to live. Wetiko short-circuits the individual's ability to see itself as an enmeshed, interdependent part of a balanced environment, and raises a self-serving ego to supremacy. It is this full separation of self from nature that makes this cannibalism, rather than simply murder. It allows, indeed it commands, the infected entity to consume far more than it needs in a blind, murderous daze of self-aggrandizement. It is the ego unchained from reason and living, acting with the malevolent logic of a cancer cell. This image was painted in 2016 as part of a collective art-based campaign we did to see if this concept was meaningful to people. I don't know if you can make it out. It's like a skull. It's like almost vomiting out oil. It's like blending into the environment. I love it. It's gruesome, but it seems pretty accurate to me as a representation of this concept of wetiko. And wetiko can describe both the infection and the body infected. So a person can be infected with wetiko, or in the case where the infection is very advanced, wetiko they can personify the disease, a wetiko. This holds true for cultures and systems as much as individuals. All can be described as being wetiko if they routinely manifest these traits. If you want to see a big wetiko in the wild, look at the White House. I've yet to come across a more perfect manifestation of wetiko in human form. In his now classic book, Columbus and Other Cannibals, which I would absolutely recommend you read, Native American historian Jack Forbes describes how there was a commonly held belief among many indigenous communities that the European colonialists were so chronically and uniformly infected with wetiko that it must be a defining characteristic of the culture from which they came. Examining the history of these cultures, Forbes laments, and I quote, "Tragically, the history of the world these past 2,000 years is in great part the etiology of the wetiko disease." For Forbes, bringing his people into the wetiko culture is the very last thing they need. And that's the only answer we have for them. It's the only answer we have for people in the villages of Peru and on the plains of Africa. It is the definition of a one-size-fits-all solution on a planet that craves and thrives on diversity. So if we stripped all the familiar development narrative and rhetoric away and look at exactly where we are and how we can design a better agenda, what would we do? Well, there are several places we could start. We could start with our values. We could start with outcomes. We could start with policies and procedures. I'm going to start with imperatives. Those titanic forces that are bearing down on us, that demand a fresh approach, that show up in bright neon letters just how very far from right. From there, we can start to sketch out the outlines of a different approach. Our problem, when you strip it all down, is complexity. It is the perennial problem of many human civilizations that have come before us. We just don't know when to stop, basically. We have very little sense of limit. This is one of the swerves our culture took away from the indigenous cultures we talked about. Their sense of interconnectedness is so powerful, so deeply threaded through their worldviews, that the idea of growing in ways that damage the fundamental operating of the environment is anathema. It is illogical. It does not qualify as common sense. In fact, quite the opposite. But not so us, or many of them have come before us. Ours really is a vertical culture, built on the logic of endless expansion and domination. We don't see interconnectedness and the imperative for balance. We see opportunities to expand and dominate. And we build systems and technologies to do just that. Many cultures have done this, from the Romans to the mighty Mayans to the Khmer of Asia. They all built systems, from administrative to irrigation and agriculture, that grew too complex for them to manage, that ended up collapsing because they were overstretched or became just too expensive for the civilization to sustain. But we have taken this to new heights. What makes our age so very dangerous, so much more dangerous than any age that has come before, is that our system is now fully global, which means our problems are global, which brings us into the realm of existentialism. Have you ever heard the analogy about the mind being like a wild elephant? Yeah? I'm sure some of you have. I came across this metaphor when I was doing my own work with Buddhism. It basically says that our rational brains are like a little monkey on top of a wild elephant. The monkey might feel like he's in control sometimes, when the elephant is calm and acting predictably. But when that elephant decides, as it inevitably will at some point, that it wants to do something different from the monkey, who's going to win? Well, obviously the elephant. It's far bigger, more stronger, more powerful. But when it comes to the economic system, we are like the little monkey. We think the economy serves us and obeys our commands, but it is really a steroid-fueled hulk of an elephant, with an expand and dominate logic for life. This is the logic it grew its giant muscles on. This is the logic it grew its muscles on. It's a logic that emerged from human minds, for sure, but a lot of them over a very long time period. So there is no such thing as a simple off switch in the present. No force that we have complete control over comes close to being able to bring that elephant under control in its current form, obeying its currently programmed logic for life. We do, however, have the option to reprogram that logic. The ultimate logic of any complex adaptive system is to survive and grow in some form or other. Not always physically. We humans, for example, we stop growing physically about a quarter of the way through our lives, if we live a normal lifespan. The rest of our growth is either just simply replacing old cells, which is really more maintenance of growth, or it is intellectual, spiritual, and social. This is why we make a distinction between growth and maturity. But right now, no such distinctions exist for the economy. Growth means growth in its physical size. In fact, we have an economy programmed almost like a human body in a state of permanent puberty. I'm going to take just one aspect of this program and try to demonstrate why the situation we are in right now is far more urgent, and far less under control than even we think. And we're most definitely in the more globally aware, more alert camp as humans go. I wanted to convince you to refocus a significant amount of your campaign firepower on reprogramming the fundamental rules of the economy, which means reframing logics, which means changing narratives. Now brace yourselves, you're not going to like this. This means breaking with the SDG narrative. With our SDG narrative of being on our way to eradicate poverty by 2030. It means embracing post-capitalist logic. It means reframing development away from being a project of largely targeted charity aimed at the poorest to a project to bring as much resilience as possible to the global system by moving to a wholly new set of economic models. And note the plural there, models, not model. That's very important. This does not mean that we need to move away from our focus on the poorest. Inequality is a great and profound destabilizer. Reducing inequality means increasing systemic resilience. But we have to place it in a far bigger, far larger frame of logic. That is essentially my core pitch for you today. The rest of the speech is to provide context and support for this argument, and to help you listen as openly as possible, because what I'm suggesting is not easy. It's a big shift from what a lot of us are doing now, and it's a lot to ask. But as I hope as I'm about to say will demonstrate, we're out of time for anything less. The greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function. It's by an economist called Albert. In maths, the exponential function looks like that. In graph form, it looks like that. That upswing. A simpler way to understand it, though, is to tell a little story. I'm sure some of you will have heard this one before, but bear with me because it's going to be a bit confusing. So once upon a time, this is a story, not a narrative. And a narrative, but it's a story. Once upon a time, there was a village with a beautiful pond. It was thriving, healthy ecosystem, full of fish and snails and frogs and aquatic flora. It was a major food source for the village. One day, a man arrived with a lily plant. He said to the villagers, "Look at this beautiful plant. This will look wonderful in your pond." And the villagers agreed. They said, "It's beautiful, let's put it in." So they did. A small leaf with a tiny little bud of a flower on it. After about a week, one of the young villagers noticed something. The lily was growing very fast. It seemed to be doubling in size each week. What had started out as a little leaf in the corner of the pond was now quite a big leaf, covering about 1/8 of the pond's surface. That night, the villagers met at their regular monthly council meeting. The young villager brought up the lily. The council heard her out and nodded their collective heads. "Yes, we can see this might be a problem at some point in the future. It will cut out the sunlight and the oxygen in the water, and it will cause havoc to our food supplies. Right now it is still small, but it is growing. Young villager," they said, "look into this for us. Come back to us at our next village meeting in 4 weeks' time with some better information about the options we have here. How we can keep the beauty without surrender, without the danger." We agreed. It sounded like a very reasonable plan. And no one paid much attention to the question after that. They realized what was happening, disaster struck. The lily had covered the entire surface of the pond and started starving out all the life beneath it. What the villagers hadn't counted on was the exponential function. If the leaf doubles its size every week, it takes a week to go from 1/8 of the pond to 1/4 of the pond, and a week to go from 1/4 of the pond to 1/2 of the pond, and only 1 week after that to cover the whole pond. What the exponential function tells us is that growth under certain circumstances is non-linear. It doesn't follow a 1 step followed by another step path. It follows a 1 step followed by 2 steps, followed by 4 steps, followed by 8 steps path. And when growth hits that curve, things start happening extremely quickly. Now let's talk about money. I want to ask you to think about money through a different lens than you might normally think of it. I'm going to ask you to think of money through this lens. Money as a claim on future energy use. Let me explain briefly. All money creates the demand for more money. There are 3 layers to this. First, we have the interest-bearing nature of money. Every dollar, yen, and euro in existence is, among other things, a promissory note that must generate more of itself in order to be able to be paid back. Mortgage or your car loan or credit card loan, nothing is given for free, it all comes with interest. You have to pay back more than you borrowed. That's as true for governments as it is for individuals. Creating money by creating the central banks or lending between governments, everything comes with a price. More must come in than goes out. What this means is that there is never enough money in the system to pay back all the debts. That is an unbreakable requirement for growth. Unbreakable not only by normal custom, but by law, everywhere. We have cast off much of the wisdom of our own cultures in creating this system. Many of our own spiritual traditions, including the Christian Bible, ban usury, which is the lending of money and interest. I wonder why. And the everywhere in that sentence is critically important, because when we talk about growth, what we're actually talking about is the growth of everything, everywhere, all the time. It's not that some bits of the economy that's not acceptable. It doesn't feed the elephant in steroids. Every country, every company, every individual has to grow their supply of capital all the time. We just call it growth, utilitarian growth. Second, there is a fractional reserve banking system, which means that the amount of money lent out from central banks far exceeds the actual real money that exists. In fact, 97% of money in the world is purely digital. It's created, it exists only in the virtual world. Third, the fact that since Richard Nixon left the gold standard in 1971, all the world's currencies are free floating. None of them is tied to a physical asset. This means that there is again nothing to stop the infinite growth of the supply of capital. There is no anchor holding it down. That is an enabler of exponential growth in money supply. Put these things together, and you might expect that there might have been an explosion in the amount of money in the world, and you'd be right. This is data collected from 73 different central banks. In 1971, when the gold standard was surrendered, and since then, you've got different countries there, US, Japan, Europe, China, and others. The supply of money has gone up, and that stops in 2009, but actually one of the biggest pulses that created so much money in the system was the 2008 crisis and the quantitative easing that followed. If you look at the size of the American economy by itself, supply went like this, 2008. So, you have the fact that however much money there is today, there must be more tomorrow, just to wheel the oils of the economy. That sets up the imperative for endless growth, first in the money supply, which requires growth in the overall size of economies. That hulking wild elephant must get bigger and stronger. Then, add to this the final fact that every single good or service in our economy requires energy input to be produced. If I buy a cup of coffee with a dollar bill, that's, among other things, the energy that went into that coffee. Added all up is the fact that our economy, our civilization, the bigger it gets, the more heat it produces. And there's no getting around that. And we can mention the idea of decoupling here. I'm sure many of you are very aware of the debate about whether we can decouple the economy from rising emissions. And there is certainly some evidence that that has started to happen a little bit. GDP and energy use are not so tightly correlated now as they used to be. It's quite categorical on this. Even relative decoupling as a strategy for dealing with climate change is a myth. An absolute decoupling, which is what we need to keep this economy intact. We certainly cannot rest our hopes on either of those things. Now let's put some real world numbers on this. The IMF says the global economy has to grow at 3% annually just to keep afloat. To add 3% on the 2015 economy is the equivalent of adding the entire economy just in the difference. So all the cars, all the flights, all the products and services that were made in 1970 have to be added onto the economy from 2015 to 2016. And because it's on an exponential curve, 1976 economy, and you know that, 1980 economy, and so the size of growth is on that exponential curve. The prime directive of capitalism is to grow the supply of capital. This directive is written into the rules of money and debt. All money creates a demand for more money, and in the over-leveraged, free-floating economy of today, that also means more debt. There's energy use in the future. The explosion of money and debt is an energy consumption. The CONCORD is represents a looking glass into the future. Today's economy, with all the attached energy consumption, is but a foreshadowing of the explosion we are setting off in the economy tomorrow. We are on an exponential curve. We have to start thinking about the villages and the fish pond. We are behaving. Let's meet again in a month to see where we are. Except we say it's slightly different. about this. We envisage a world in which every economy enjoys a sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth and decent work for all. That's actually SDG Target 8. This is it. This is one of this accompanying text actually indicates to assist this work. Quality, accessible, timely, reliable, disaggregated. Such data is key to decision making. Data and information. We agree to intensify our efforts. Every African country needs to develop data. We are committed to developing broader measures of progress to complement. At the end of that paragraph, you wouldn't even call that an afterthought. You would call that an after the afterthought thought. That's the village council saying, come back in a month as the lily is growing. Before anybody thinks that renewables are coming along and are going to save us here, let me burst your bubble. We can get excited because the news is full of innovations like Elon Musk and his batteries, which are great. And we see lots of charts like this, which is uptake in solar energy. It looks great. Kind of exponential itself, and I'll make a point about that in a second. But when you embed this in the larger picture, which is of course on its own exponential trajectory, this is the 2008 the International Energy Agency Outlook Report, which they do every 2 years. And this is this year's one. This is taking the energy consumption up to 2035. Renewables, here. Coal, gas, oil, 2035. There is no serious projection that suggests that we're not going to be using fossil fuels at about 85% of our energy by 2050. What we love, and what we get caught up on a lot is this line here, how renewables are going up. And that's great, of course, that's wonderful, that's great. But so is everything else. If you look at the shares, renewables are taking greater share. But if you look at the aggregate, we're not dealing with this at all. But I do want to mention this as well. It's a check on my own self, because this is another really interesting graph from the Economic Outlook report. How bloody awful we are at understanding the exponential function. The World Economic Outlook for 2002 is a blue line. That's what it projected. 2004, that's what it projected. You can go up. 2006, 8, 20, every year, far less than they have. Every single year. And they make the mistake every 2 years. The same mistake every 2 years. Understand that we cannot grasp the exponential function. But even if you took the most hopeful scenario, even if you go, yes, look at how fantastic that graph is, because it's, the innovations around solar energy are so great. They don't tackle this. Okay, almost there. Okay, I have to burst one more of your bubbles, in case you have them. A lot of people are talking about digital technologies, especially things like cryptocurrencies right now, the blockchain. These things are great. And we must absolutely include these things in our thinking and our strategizing. But just a little sobering thought. One Bitcoin transaction now uses as much energy as the average house uses in a week. Yes, these are technologies we should be thinking about and understanding and incorporating in our visions. I'm not arguing against doing everything humanly possible to keep that graph going the way it is. Absolutely. And we are a fan of cryptocurrencies. In fact, at the Rules, we're in the middle of a campaign promoting the idea of a cryptocurrency-based universal basic income because of its narrative power and potential. And we can talk about that later if you want. But we should not confuse positive moves with solutions, and that's what we're doing right now. Renewables may offer a solution to 22nd century energy demand, and we should do everything possible to support that development and roll it out, but we've got to get through the 21st century first. And renewables can't solve for us in that time scale. So to return briefly to complexity, I hope I've been able to show that we are like that little monkey on the top of the steroid-fueled elephant of this economy. And it's obeying a suicidal logic, much like the logic of the lily leaf, growing exponentially until it kills all the life in the pond, or in our case, the planet. The suicidal logic is a logic into greater and greater complexity. Just think about fossil fuels. We are rapidly running out of access to easy oil. We're not having to look. We're not having to look at things like we're now having to look at things like tar sands and fracking for natural gas. That is an increase in complexity. That is a natural. That's entropy. That's the laws of dynamics, laws of thermodynamics. So, and this is just a micro example of the meta trend. The only thing we can do now, the only thing worth spending a lot of our time on, is to reprogram the logic of the economy. And this is the imperative that demands a new development narrative. So now I have some further recommendations for you. What we don't have time to explore today are all the other economic models that are on offer. And there are plenty. Just recently, an old Oxfam colleague of mine called Kate Rayworth published a book called Donut Economics. That's one of the latest, I think one of the best breakdowns of everything that's wrong with capitalism and alternatives. And I would certainly recommend you read it if you are. There you go. Winning in alternatives. The problem isn't that we don't have options. It is, as we always know, we sometimes call it political. We're just not convinced that we need to. Well, we really need to. Time is up. The development industry can do on its own. In this room with us, traction in domestic politics. However much we what we can contribute is to resist. There is no middle ground. So as development professionals and campaigners, how can we bring our own house in order? Here are some steps I would take to reorient the development narrative. And one really important point. We learned some lovely language. I don't know if people know Helen Norberg Hodge. She's like a long stand, she's been around doing fantastic work since the 70s. She talks about the problem, the challenge of resistance and renewal. It's critically important that we work on the two things similarly. Resist the expansion and the deepening and the continuing logic. Just as when I was originally feeling lost, I was both unsure of what I was resisting anymore and unsure of what I was working towards. Names that build in the ideas and the physical reality within you. So here are 5 recommendations for you. Firstly, most define the problem accurately. And it would come back 5 minutes, come back 5 minutes later. And eventually the car stopped and a man got out. And he said, and the man said, "Oh, I've been going back and forwards. I really need to get to Dublin, but I can't find my way. Can you help?" And the farmer looked at him and he scratched his beard and he said, "Start from here." Well, the story we tell about poverty is I wouldn't start from here. If we don't see the problem clearly, our responses will always miss the mark. Right now, the development industry is stuck in a tired and inaccurate narrative that profoundly misrepresents both the scale and the nature of the problems. The UN, and I see the posters around here, are very keen to make the world believe that we have halved poverty since 1990 and we can eradicate it by 2030. That is patently ridiculous. My emotion to it there. Patently ridiculous. It is little better than a marketing lie. And yet the entire development industry supports this story. The claims rest on the shakiest of data. Currently rests at $1.90 a day. After controversial downwards adjustments in recent years, if you look every time they've changed the poverty line, shock horror, poverty numbers drop. Poverty numbers always drop every time they change the poverty line. Hundreds of millions of people are no longer in poverty every time they change the poverty line. Most scholars now agree largely that the 190 figure we use today is far too low to be meaningful, and that in order to achieve even basic nutrition, infant survival, and normal life expectancy, people need around $7.40 a day. If we measure global poverty at this level, we see that 4.2 billion people, 60% of humanity, are unable to secure the resources they need for basic survival. And this number has grown since 1990, not shrunk. The same goes for hunger. The development industry tells us that hunger is down to only 700 billion people. But the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, admits that their core definition of hunger is, and I quote, too conservative to inform policy, unquote. They suggested a more accurate definition would show that hunger and malnutrition actually affect 2.5 billion people. And again, that number is rising, not falling. This might sound like a daunting challenge, I understand. The entire edifice of the development industry is built on these story foundations, and things do not change easily. But there are signs that some, or at least those close to the mainstream, are starting to move into this space. Just last week, in the first major speech, Kate Ossamore, the new Shadow Secretary of State for International Development in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, said this: "We will never achieve an end to poverty if we don't measure it accurately. We need a better poverty line." That is a green shoot to be nurtured and tended and watered. It is a time to acknowledge the fact that the global economy is not working for the vast majority of humanity. Indeed, the per capita income gap between rich countries of the north and poor countries of the south has tripled since 1960 and continues to widen. Given the scale of the problem, it is clear that if we want to eradicate poverty and reduce global inequality, it will take an awful lot more than just tweaking around the edges with a bit of aid here and there. It will require overhauling the rules of the global economy to make it fundamentally fairer. Recommendation 2, reframe the core mission of development. At the heart of this framing is the idea of one global system. At the moment, we tend to treat each unit in the development universe to a degree, even in the SDG paradigm, as discrete and standalone. There are lots of silos. Governments, NGOs, development banks, tax havens, civil society, education policy, humanitarian policy, health policy, climate adaptation, climate mitigation, they're all seen and talked about to a degree still in silos. And that is because we live within, we are born, our brains express the world as machine metaphor. We are not trained to think systemically. We do not do it naturally. Rhetoric.
I'm going to do that really annoying thing.
Yeah, I'm almost there.
No, it's great, but I was.
Yeah.
And we're going to make sure your speech is made available as well.
Okay, rattle through just a second. If you want to compare the SDG language with something far better, look at the Pope's encyclical. And again, look at the language that he used there, the language of interconnectors. Look at the metaphors he used with the deep logic. That man thinks, at least the people who advised him and have the right, think systemically. The SDGs think mechanically. And it is a mission-critical difference. Okay, recommendation 3. Demand action on totalitarian growth and GDP now. Now. This is one of the biggest, most important things we need to do. We need to fracture the logic of growth. It is killing us. And the leading edge of this argument is GDP as a measure of progress. That needs to change. Have you heard the old saying, we measure what we value or we value what we measure? Well, GDP measures the size of the wild elephant and all it wants it to do is grow. As long as we're defining progress, that way we're screwed. So it's time for NGOs to step up into this space. If we can be the ones to help frame this conversation, it can be done through the lens of global stability and ensuring the poorest don't suffer beyond what is already inevitable. If we leave it to others, it will be done through the perspective of every nation for themselves, which is a very likely alternative. America first, anyone? Just as nationalism is on the rise around the world, we are also seeing glimmers of hope. Did anyone see this a couple of weeks ago, the New Zealand Prime Minister? I like that as a headline, but what I like more is this. The measures for us have to change. We need to make sure that we're looking at people's ability to actually have a meaningful life. And that's not what GDP does. That is a green shoot to be watered and tended. This one is going to be really hard. Move from false hope to real hope. Let's skip through this. False hope is that we can stop climate change. False hope is that we can promise no critical breakdowns in the essential systems in the global system, from food and energy to the ecosystem itself. False hope is that we can sustain a global neoliberal capitalist system much longer. Something to hope for. False hope is that we can eradicate poverty by 2030. I don't care how well it tests in polls and focus groups. So does the idea that we can end cancer tomorrow. But it's just not true. And selling something that isn't true just because people like it and it gets their eyes on it is a definition of cynical inauthenticity. There's plenty of real hope to be had. Real hope lies in honesty. Real hope lies in fostering independence from the global system. It lies in reinvigorating and the informal economies that we all rely on. Real hope actually can lie in decentralizing technologies like the blockchain, which have the potential to transform power structures. Real hope lies in building new narratives based on intrinsic values and systemic metaphors. Real hope lies in the knowledge we have makes life worth about what makes life worth living. Finally, here's an interesting fact. Indigenous people territories span 24% of the Earth's surface, but they're home to 80% of the world's biodiversity. That's not a coincidence. There is so much inspiration for us in indigenous narratives that we really need to be looking for. The blindness the Western world has to the sophistication of indigenous worldviews is one of the most poisonous vestiges of our colonial past. We are not the experts we need right now. The evidence for that is all around us. It is our culture that has deprioritized life in service of capital. It is our culture that is ripping this divine creation apart. Ours is the memory that goes back just a handful of generations instead of the hundreds of generations. It isn't our fault in any simple sense. We didn't create this system, but it came from our ancestors. It is propelled forward by our leaders, our life choices, and I'm afraid we are feeding with a development story. So yes, it is our culture, and we have a duty to take responsibility for that. How different a story is that from the traditional story of development? Rich countries generously giving aid to poor countries to eradicate poverty in the next 13 years. That is bullshit. Oh, yeah, God, that's depressing. I'm skipping over the depressing ones. I'm coming back to this. We've all seen these things coming out, and they're coming out with increasing speed and regularity. Okay, this is my conclusion. At the rules, we start from two basic assumptions. Power rests on the ability to control language. And humans make sense of their world through narratives. She who controls and frames the narrative if we cannot better master our language, we will always be pushing the rock up a very steep hill. Century, in some cases millennia ago. Active mode. This is a position of defensiveness, which is a position of weakness. We are not winning. You know that, right? We are losing this war right now. But we have seen with people like Kate Osimoran, the new Prime Minister of New Zealand, that there are some green shoots, even in the mainstream political space, which, honestly, I was pretty much giving up hope for. The question we have to ask ourselves in this room, are we tending the green shoots or are we protecting the concrete? We cannot do both. We may never win. It may be impossible. The die may be cast. But even in the worst climate change and ecological collapse predictions come true, it is highly unlikely that all of humanity will be lost. What is inevitable is that however we survive, we will not live in a global neoliberal capitalist society we are in today. That is coming to an end. The era of growth is coming to an end. they amount to the same thing. I just want to leave you with one thought. Everybody in this room is blessed. We are alive on this planet when it needs us most. When protection is so very needed. We get to witness all the capacity of humanity. We fall. Never in human history this question on this scale. We must throw off our reserve, our fear, our professional egos. There is only one task now. The logic of the operating system. The good and bad news is that it is going to change whether we like it or not. More rather than less likely that what emerges will be a more equitable, more diverse, more human-sized, an economic model than the wild and monstrous elephant that we are currently living with.
Thank you very, very much, Martin. I think you've stimulated us, inspired us, and disrupted us, and I think that's what we need. Quickly on to you, without any more ado, and invite you action on much you agreed with. I saw you reacting to him, but much you had your own angle to. So I want to invite you to on this topic.
Buenos días. Have some water. Swallow.
Yes.
I see that many people are getting up to go to the bathroom, and I don't want to talk to empty seats. Can we take 3 or 5 minutes and you really go to the bathroom or get some air or drink some water?
Sure. Do you want to do that? Do you want to take
Get
a...
up and do this too. And come back. Because otherwise I'm going to talk to the empty seats.
Yes.
But then anyway, it's working. Yeah.
What's your music?
If I can ask you to take their seats, please. Let's Everybody.
3 minutes.
Thanks very much. Everybody take their seats. So I think that was much needed, Martin. You were very wise there to allow us just a little to digest those words of Martin. What we're going to do now is we're going to hear from Marta. We're going to have lots of opportunity over the next day and a half now for everyone else's feedback, and I think that's very, very important. Lots of provocative things have been said, and I think it's very important that there's lots of space for us all to hear each other. And this will happen. We've got a masterclass in the afternoon, and I think that will be the moment for more of the interaction and perhaps the challenging or the questioning or the hearing other points of view. But what we want to do now is hear from Marta, then we're going to have one more session before lunch. We will shorten lunch just a little bit, and then we'll be into the masterclass in the afternoon, and that will be the moment for the interaction that we were going to have today. So Marta, I give you the floor. Everyone's refreshed and good to hear your words.
Use this. Woo. Did you do this? When you went up? How about this? You have to check it out, you know. It was a big banquet. A big banquet in my country and in what is now called Latin America. Notice I say it like that. In our mind, we are not Latin America. We are who we are, you know, that continent is ours. But we need a rest after that, you know. We need to go and be alone with your stomach. And really think it through and digest it. And we are not having that chance now. But I'm going to try to get you to, so don't think that I'm talking to you, think that I'm talking with you, because I've been watching you. Yes, and don't, like, you know, don't get behind that. I'm going to watch you. Now, you know, I don't know where to get started after that, because it's a lot, and we have to pay attention to what he's bringing us. He did a big homework. I come from a different situation. I come from having been born in my country, which is called El Salvador, and they call it El Salvador because it was the savior for the oligarchs, not for the people of my country, you know. We are indigenous peoples. I look white, and I know that nobody from my family came from Europe, so I had to come to the conclusion that probably was fake. I died, my father died too, and you know, like, our country's name is Cuscatan. The Spaniards call it Cuscatlan because they can say Cuscatan, and it means land of riches. And we are now supposedly one of the most impoverished. Please pay attention to the words I'm using. One of the most impoverished countries in the world. And I thought, but you know, are people so stupid that we call it land of riches? And then I talked with my mom. And my mom, you know, told me, well, they are teaching things in school to you that are wrong. Because, you know, especially in the church also. And that comes from Columbus having gotten lost. Got lost. He didn't discover anything. That's how it started, you know. Oh, I found it. Oh, I discovered. And in the name of that, I can take possession. He used the word. In the name of that, I have possession of this land. In the name of the church and the queen. That's why I don't like kings and queens and princes and all that. Now when? But you see, the problem is that that's where the mess started. Because he gave you a paradigm of discovery. And then, you know, we were watching him and said, do you need anything? Do you look sick? And we started to heal him. And we fed him, you know. We're going to kill him because he couldn't find any land. And so finally, you know, he got there. We fed him. You know what we fed him also? Fish, because he came into an island. And now, look at the development paradigm. People tell me, when I am working in my country to make transformations about all this crap that we have to live because we call poverty crap, you know? And another word that Spanish know well, just start with the name. You know, they say to me, don't give them the fish to the poor. Teach them to fish. And we have always known how to fish. How did Columbus and all of them made it back? We fed them, we healed them with our natural plants, our natural knowledge that the people say, you know, traditional knowledge, because Western civilization, they call it, and that's how they call it. They say science to what we know is traditional knowledge. I never went to hospital because I grew up in a family where I was taught how to prevent, you know, getting sick, being well, and helping that community to be sick, health, healing, you know. And people, when they didn't know what to do with a problem that is related to physical, spiritual, and mental health, they came to my mom, and I saw her talking with people. We talked it over, and we figured out how to help each other, you know. You know, our culture is around medicine, but then now we have to pay a lot for health systems, and then you know what's happening in the US? Those people are dismantling all that, and then they have opiates. Oh my goodness, you know, going the wrong way. So that development paradigm of don't give them the fish, teach them to fish, sketch it out. Know that that is an invention that people, it sounds good, but it's all wrong. Because people all around the world, we know these things I'm talking about. Another thing that they tell us, oh, these are more sophisticated people, they tell me, live simply, so others may simply live. And I say, but I am in the other parts. And I don't want to simply live, I just want to live simply too. You know? Think of that. You know, we don't need any help. No help at all. We don't need you to be killing yourselves every day, every weekend, marching for us. No. We don't need you to be denouncing for us. We don't need any of that aid that is in your development programs, and I have seen how they get used, and they have taken a lot of the pimping that's going on, and a lot of the corruption that's going on, both in these countries and in our countries, because you create elites. But there is something that we all need. To know that we are one, that we are community, that you better keep your house in order, because you are at the source of what's happening to us. Columbus crack, you know, that they discovered us, is still going on. This idea that these people know better and that they can civilize us. Indigenous peoples in the so-called Americas now, especially in Canada and US, notice that I don't say America either, even though I don't like to say America, but they are not Americans here. They are United States. So, you know, in there, they took the children from the indigenous families so they could take the savage out of them. And still is these very people that he's talking about, that we don't know, you know, they were fighting to get out of those schools and go back to their families. And we have seen those stories happen in Australia, everywhere. Even to this point, you know, right now, on the SDGs, we turn them around. We work on sustainability. We don't work on sustainable development goals because that development thing is not ours. And we prefer the word from the Portuguese people that say, instead of desarrollo, desenvolvimiento. Open it up to life, you know. That's a great word. Desenvolvimiento. How do we do it so that everybody can be their very most? You know, from now to future generations. And for that, we need the planet, which is not our planet. Touch that out of your concept. It's not our planet, it's not our oceans, it's not our rivers, it's not our environment, it's the environment. I was taught that they are living beings. And that my mom taught me. Because in school, oh mama, you know, water is you know, it's a mineral. And minerals don't feel, don't think. Who told you that? In school, he said, that's wrong. That's the vital liquid. It's the liquid of life. And you must respect it. Also in church, I came back from church one day, because you know, like, we had to go to church, because remember, it was in the name of the church and the queen. And so I told my mom, hi mama, my poor mom, you know, she had to deal with me with all that crap that was being put in my head. Her name is Eve. Eva. And I said, Mama, you have to change your name. You know, I was about 6 or 7. Why? Because you know that she's the one that gave Adam the apple, and because of that, we are all sinners. And because we are all sinners, we are out of paradise. What? Matita, come. And she took me by the hand and took me to a little garden that she had. She's a mountain woman, and she knew how to live in the mountains. And we had a little garden that we had to do. My job was to sweep all the flowers in the late afternoon after I came from work, from school. So she said, see, look at the sky. Look at all these flowers. Look at the butterflies. Look at, the birds, how they sing. They get up early in the morning to sing praises. We are alive, we are alive. And what do you do when you are, that's how we are taught. And she said, this is paradise. We have never been out of paradise, but people want to take paradise out of us. And I thought, poor mom, she only went to third grade, And they continue to put all kinds of crabs in us, the civilization and democracy, but they were mistreating everybody around us, because we had to become middle class. And middle class looked down on the other ones. And we looked down on anybody that didn't look. I was working with my dad, and I'm the oldest, and I'm the only one that looks right in the family. And my father was working with me, and we were great friends. We were talking, and then this man, dark man also, my father was dark too, and then he said, when he saw me, oh, is this your daughter? And my father said, this is Tita, my oldest. And he put his hand on me, and he said, how nice, Benavides. You have better the race. The race was better because I was blonde, green eyes, and white. And then, I went back to my mom. What's the race, Mama? Running around or what, And how come you have better? And stay with me, And I know that I am from indigenous culture, but I also know that because of my father, black blood came into us. And I'm very proud because when I think, and I had to study all this, and I think of the history of that, I say, and we made it as sardines, but we made it. That is powerful, I thought, So I'm very proud, Too. And then because of all the conditions at home, also the Turks. But they were the people from Palestine that were kicked out of Palestine, and they could only travel with Turkish passports. They went to my country. Marry those two. And I said, great, look what a great person I am, This is how we have to teach and know that we are global and planetary citizens, And every weekend, we went to this little house that my mom saved for years so that she could buy a little piece of land that we still have it. That is a permaculture farm. And that we have it near San Salvador so it can help clean the air for polluted San Salvador because it keeps developing, so it keeps more polluted to the point that people are getting very sick. And then El Salvador is going through desertification. And that means that, we are losing all the water. And that means that the rivers that come to our country come from other countries. And that means that we have to be good brothers and sisters with the other nations and develop diplomacy and work and get our governments, administration of governments, they are our staff, that's why we should call them administration of government. And they have to work to bring peace so that we can have our water come to our rivers. And that they don't pollute them with all the agribusiness that's happening in Guatemala and Honduras. And it's not the Guatemalans and the Honduras, it's the great big business. And if you saw the story about Catalonia yesterday, the mayors were out there talking, no, we need our right to self-determination. And we believe that in what is now called Latin America. But right at the same time, those people, and that's how they put it in the news, while these 200 mayors are out here talking about the right to self-determination inside this private enterprise, all the people that have businesses and say, nationalism and populism is not good for business. And they tell you. So now, within the SDGs, we use it. And we tell people, this is what they're talking, but this is how we talk. We are fighting very hard for people to have pensions and to have social protection. Not that we believe it the way it is, And that's the only way right now. So that we say little kids will have their grandparents living decent life at the end of their lives. And the ones that haven't been born will also have that assured. But in indigenous ways, we don't talk like that. We believe that we should have, and we know that we should create a community that will take care of planet in that order, of life. So this is the daycare of biodiversity, and where probably most people haven't done anything about it. You know, it's ending in 2020, and then, you know, about humans. That's how we have to work. On indigenous processes, that's how we have to work. Planet, life, people. And so, you know, because see, the way that we live is very different than what you have, probably. So it used to be that during the war in El Salvador, when I was working with Monsignor Romero, we had to hide to read, to hear the radio, to find out what was going on. We had to hide because we were subversive. And I kept telling everybody, no, you know, we had to tell even the administration of government that they were hunting for us and the despots were hunting for us. No, I am not a subversive. Who says I'm a subversive? No, you know, we have to tell them like that. And we were all subversives. The Catalonians are subversives. They want the version from under to come up. And it's not because they are poor. It is rich. You know, it is a very rich quality to know who you are and where do you should go, and that you have to be responsible for your life. So one of the guys that we loved a lot, we love singers, our singers. Both the ones that we can take serenades with, and you know, some of the songs that we serenade with are very great also in social concept and wisdom. One, he would write something like, poor Juan Comodoro. He went down to look for water, and he found petroleum. That's how it is. We found something that we think is the answer. Water was the answer. But we found oil, and we started to do it. So we diverted from our path. And another song from that guy says, I'm so sorry for my boss. He thinks that I'm the poor one. The boss, you know, make his riches without all of us working. So he's the poor one. You know, and if we were to transform and understand how things are, you know, what we should be about. I had a struggle with my sister not too long ago. You know, we are very close sisters, and I'm the oldest. But we had an encounter, and I thought, I'm going to take a ride. So, you know, like, we have buses that just go, and sometimes I just take the bus wherever it's going. I go and sit in the park at the end of that route, and I watch the people, you know, and I try to do my discernment. And in that little town, it's an indigenous town in Guatemala, and it was a Sunday, and the mayor's office was open. And I thought, how come it's open? I'm going to run. And I'm working there. The greatest gift I got that day, there was in the bulletin board a sign that the people have made, handmade, you know, and they have put different colors to the letters. And it says something like this. The only thing we ask from the Great Spirit is that while the sun continues to shine and, you know, take us on our path, that we live a meaningful and useful existence. And I thought, why not? That has to be an everyday prayer. Know why we are here on earth. Know what is our purpose. Know that we have come for a purpose, to live a useful and meaningful existence. And that's what gives us the joy of being alive. So I am challenging you to study all this stuff that we probably did a very good job. But don't get lost. Know that you have to do that for yourselves, not to help us. Know that you have to do that so you can create a different world order, because on our watch, a different world order is being shaped. Going on and on and on. And I found out that, for example, how come the Baptists went to El Salvador? Well, during the World War I, they divided. The big power divided where they were going. And that's pimping. I don't care, you know, how good you want to do. But for example, in Nicaragua, you know, we have to know that people think we know clearly what's happening with us and to us and what we should do. And so at that little island, where they didn't even have a place to sit, on a Sunday morning, they sit down with the great poet, one of the great poets of Nicaragua, and they were talking about this impoverished, not poor, okay, and then the other ones are enriched. That means it's a system of getting rich, okay, like a la Trump. And so these people were saying, we will forever be poor. How come the others said? Well, in the Bible it says that the poor you will always have with you. And then they said, yeah. And then somebody else says, well, as long as we have poverty, we will always have the poor. So stop the roots of what creates poverty. Go to that. Start figuring out what is it that is creating poverty. My country is a factory of impoverishment. Because we have the maquilas and the young women from the countryside come there just to sew here and sew there, put a button here. That's not life. And then whenever they decide, they can quit and they can have a different name, the company, and they don't pay it, So all the stuff that we are talking on the SDGs, if we are really serious, and it says that no one should be left behind, we are setting the basis up to 2030 to figure out how is it that we are going to correct the colonial processes that have brought us this far. We have to correct that, and we can correct the present, and we can on purpose create a different world. The last thing I want to tell you is that at the COP is very sad what's going on in there. The place is empty, but there was one, check the inauguration. All the people that spoke clearly on what needs to be done, and I agree. But we got to do the homework. We got to do it seriously. But there was a ritual to start, and there was these warriors that danced and sang, and then they did one thing that to me is very important, and I will just describe it quickly for you. They had a big bowl that was made out of wood, and then they put some water in it. And it was only ritual. Somebody else gave the water, the other one poured it, and it was very ritualistic, beautiful, beautiful. I'm watching, and then they say, then they brought this material that they use for making their dresses. It's like a material from plants, and they made the huts out of that too. And so this material that they make also their baskets and other things with, they put it in the water, and they put it in the water, and put it in the water, and put it in the water until all the water was taken by that. And then the guy gave it back to the warriors. And then those warriors worked with it and all that, just fixing it, and gave it back to the guy that was sitting there. And then he went over again and over again. And finally, there was no water left in that bowl. But he gave it to them, and then he came back. He came back to them, and then he was twisting it and twisting it and twisting it. And then there was the guy that was just waiting for that. And then finally, this were the warriors from Fiji. And I tell you, it's so symbolic. Finally, he squeezed a little of water out of that. And this little, smaller than this, to the German representative of the body. And then she didn't know what to do. And she didn't say, this probably is not clean or whatever. She swallowed in front of everybody. Then another time, and did it again, and then took it and gave it to the guy from Fiji. That's what we have left because of what we have done. And so now we have the chance to correct and really create a millennium peace. If we want to, durable, sustainable peace, which is not sustainable development, or we will see what happened in the Caribbean. And the challenge is start so that nobody is left behind. You better make a study of why Puerto Rico is going through what's going on. What is called now Latin America. You don't. The US people don't know, even though that is a free associated state. Watch it, because next year is the hurricane season again. And there is no way that the people of those islands will be able to build what is needed to withstand all the winds and the hurricane. And that's going to go straight to the US. And it's going on and on and on like that. So we don't need help, but we need to work together. That's it.
And thank you both. I think you complemented each other very, very nicely there, and you've done a great job for us to set up this lab. I'm going to leave it there. There's going to be lots of opportunity in the afternoon for all the questions and the comments to hear from all of you and all of us. We've recorded this opening session, so there'll be an opportunity for everybody to go back and Martin in particular cited lots of different books, and we'll put all that reading list up so everybody can refer to his presentation and the different books that he referred to. So I'm going to leave it at that, just to say a big, big word of thanks to you both for getting us off to such a great start. Thank you.